Welcome back to BIM Heroes Radio. This is Episode 11.
Episode 11.
Where we focus on cultural competence in leadership.
Okay.
Tying into Week 11 of the BIMHero.io Leadership Development Program.
You know, this topic,
Yeah.
it really seems to be hitting home with a lot of you out there leading teams in the AEC world, especially in a globalized industry like ours.
It's true. We're constantly collaborating with people from all over the world working on projects that span countries and cultures, even entire continents.
And that's exactly why we're focusing on
Right.
cultural competence this week.
It's about giving you the tools and insights to build stronger, more inclusive teams, no matter where your projects take you.
It's about the people.
Our own BIM Hero community is a perfect example of this global interconnectedness.
Right.
We have members from over 100 countries.
That's right. And this kind of reach brings a unique set of leadership challenges. It's no longer enough to just manage projects.
Right.
We need to lead people effectively across cultural boundaries.
So where do we even begin? What are the fundamental building blocks of this cultural competence that you mentioned?
Well, I think Ralph Montague frames it beautifully in his article. He talks about finding the balance, the dance, as he calls it, between respecting cultural differences and maintaining a sense of unity within a team. It's about recognizing that people from different backgrounds might have different values, communication styles, even different approaches to problem solving.
It's like finding that sweet spot between order and chaos, right?
Absolutely.
Respecting individual differences while still working together towards a common goal.
Exactly. And to really illustrate this point, I think it's helpful to hear from someone who's lived this experience firsthand. Rina Sahay, a South Asian AEC professional working in the United States, shared a powerful story with the BIM Hero community.
I remember reading that. What struck me was that even though she grew up in the U.S., she still encountered cultural challenges when she returned to work there as a professional.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Her experience highlights how these nuances can often go unnoticed until you're immersed in a different cultural context. One specific anecdote that stood out to me was when Rina described a team meeting where she felt her contributions were being overlooked, even though she had valuable insights to share.
I think that's something many of us can relate to, regardless of our cultural background. That feeling of not being fully heard or understood.
Absolutely. And what Rina realized was that it wasn't intentional on the part of her colleagues. It was simply a difference in communication styles. She had to learn to adapt her approach to be more assertive.
And ensure her voice was heard.
That's such a valuable takeaway.
It is.
It's not about forcing everyone to conform to one cultural norm, but finding ways to bridge those differences and leverage the unique strengths that each person brings to the table.
And I love how Rina encourages other South Asian professionals to embrace this challenge. She says, make your presence felt, outperform, and leverage the wisdom of both worlds. It's about finding that balance that Dan Montague talks about.
It's inspiring to see someone not shying away from those challenges, but using them as opportunities for growth and innovation.
Absolutely.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about some practical strategies for leading across cultures. Daria Zimovets really dives into this in her article on managing multicultural teams.
She makes a brilliant point about the need for leaders to adapt their approach based on the team's cultural preferences. What might be considered a strong leadership style in one culture
could be perceived as aggressive or insensitive in another.
For instance, she's contrasts the effectiveness of authoritative versus collaborative leadership styles in different cultural contexts.
That's a good one.
In some cultures, a more directive approach might be expected and respected, while in others, a more consensus-driven style would be more effective.
That's right. And it's not just about leadership styles. Decision-making processes can vary widely across cultures as well.
Zimovets actually gives a great example of this. She talks about how, in some cultures, decisions are made quickly and decisively by the leader. While in others, there's a much more collaborative and deliberative process involving input from multiple stakeholders.
And being aware of these differences can make a huge difference in how you approach leading a team, facilitating meetings, and ultimately achieving project success.
So based on Zimovets' work, what are some specific recommendations for managing these kinds of teams?
She stresses the importance of developing cultural awareness as a first step. This means taking the time to learn about the cultures represented on your team, their beliefs, their values, even their sense of humor.
It shows respect, builds trust.
It does.
And helps you avoid those unintentional faux pas that can damage relationships and derail projects.
Exactly. She also highlights the need for open discussions about cultural differences.
Creating that safe space where people feel comfortable sharing their perspectives and experiences.
Absolutely.
And having clear communication channels is vital.
Yeah.
Regular meetings, feedback sessions, even informal check-ins, all of those things help ensure everyone is on the same page. And minimize misunderstandings.
Zimovets also mentions promoting what she calls cultural intelligence training.
I was curious about that.
Yeah.
What exactly is cultural intelligence training?
Think of it like emotional intelligence,
but
with a cultural lens. It's about developing the ability to work effectively in diverse cultural settings, to adapt your communication style, and to build relationships across cultural boundaries.
It's like equipping yourself with the tools to navigate this increasingly complex global landscape.
Precisely. And finally, Zimovets reminds us that conflict is inevitable, especially in diverse teams. The key is to address it promptly and respectfully, considering all cultural perspectives.
He brings up a great point about how societal change takes time.
It does.
And that includes embracing diversity. It's an ongoing effort that requires open-mindedness from everyone involved.
It's not about reaching some kind of utopian endpoint where everyone is perfectly culturally competent. It's about continuous learning, adapting, and growing together as individuals and as teams.
And speaking of learning and adapting, I think it's a great segue into our next topic. Unconscious bias. It's something that affects all of us, even if we don't realize it.
Ah, yes, the unseen challenge. This is where things get really interesting. Larry Bridgesmith breaks this down for us in his piece on overcoming unconscious bias in the AEC industry. It really is a hidden hurdle, isn't it? Bridgesmith does a great job of explaining how these unconscious biases work and why they're so tricky to tackle.
For those who might not be familiar with the term, could you break down what unconscious bias actually is?
Well, think of it this way. Our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world around us, processing tons of information every second. To do this efficiently, our brains create mental shortcuts, automatic associations that help us categorize things and people.
It's like putting things in neat little boxes in our minds.
Exactly. And while these shortcuts can be helpful in some ways, they can also lead to unconscious biases. These biases are essentially those automatic associations that are based on stereotypes, often stemming from societal messages we've been exposed to throughout our lives.
And the scary part is we often aren't even aware of these biases, right?
That's right. They operate below the surface, influencing our perceptions and decisions, even when we consciously believe in equality and fairness.
So how does this play out specifically in the AEC world? What are some examples of unconscious bias that might show up in our industry?
Bridgesmith gives some really pointed examples. For instance, imagine a hiring manager reviewing resumes. Unconscious bias could lead them to favor a candidate with a name that sounds familiar or American over someone with a name that's harder to pronounce or seems foreign, even if their qualifications are equal.
That's such a subtle but pervasive form of discrimination. It's not necessarily intentional, but it can have a huge impact on who gets hired and who gets overlooked.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. Unconscious bias can also affect project assignments, promotions, even how we interact with colleagues on a daily basis.
Bridgesmith actually highlights a really interesting study by the Boston Consulting Group that found a direct correlation between diversity and innovation.
Yes. They found that companies with more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenue due to innovation. That's a powerful statistic.
It really drives home the point that unconscious bias isn't just an ethical issue, it's an economic one as well. When we allow unconscious bias to limit our talent pool and stifle diverse perspectives, we're ultimately hurting our own bottom line.
Absolutely. Now, Bridgesmith also contrasts unconscious bias with what's called cognitive bias. Would you like to delve into that distinction a bit?
I think that would be really helpful. What's the difference between the two?
Cognitive biases are more about flaws in our thinking processes, like confirmation bias, where we tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs, even if it's not necessarily true or accurate.
So it's more of a conscious choice, even if we're not aware that our reasoning is flawed.
Exactly. Whereas unconscious biases are more like ingrained habits of perception, often stemming from the societal stereotypes we talked about earlier.
Interesting. So these biases can actually work together to affect our judgment in various situations.
Precisely. And Bridgesmith argues that these biases can be especially impactful in fast-paced industries like AEC, where we often have to make quick decisions under pressure.
Because we're relying on those mental shortcuts even more when we don't have time to slow down and really think things through.
Exactly. He even uses the term heuristics to describe these shortcuts, which can be helpful in crisis situations when we need that fast thinking to react quickly.
But the downside is that they can also lead to biased decisions when we don't engage in that slow thinking, more deliberate and reflective mode of processing information.
Right. And in the context of unconscious bias, this can lead to us, for example, overlooking a qualified candidate because they don't fit our preconceived notions of what a successful architect or engineer should look like.
Or making assumptions about someone's capabilities based on their gender, race, or age rather than their actual skills and experience.
It's a subtle but pervasive problem. And Bridgesmith doesn't just leave us hanging with the problem. He offers some concrete solutions.
Okay, let's dive into those. What are some practical steps we can take to address unconscious bias in ourselves and our organizations?
He's a big advocate for bias training, which helps individuals become aware of their own unconscious biases.
It's like shining a light on those blind spots in our thinking, so we can start to challenge them.
He also stresses the importance of creating a truly diverse and inclusive work culture where everyone feels valued and respected regardless of their background.
And that requires a proactive effort, right? It's not something that just happens organically.
It takes intentionality, and Bridgesmith even provides a list of self-assessment tools that can help uncover hidden biases. He mentions Project Implicit Online Justice and Trailient as great resources.
Fantastic. We'll make sure to link those in the show notes for our listeners. Are there any other actionable strategies Bridgesmith recommends?
He highlights the importance of diverse hiring practices. Things like using anonymous applications or having diverse interview panels can help mitigate those snap judgments based on appearance or name.
So building systems that help us make more objective decisions rather than relying solely on intuition.
And perhaps most importantly, he reminds us that we can actually train our brains to interrupt those biased thought patterns. It's not about being powerless against our unconscious biases. We can take control.
That's a really empowering message. So it's about pausing, reflecting, and consciously choosing a different path when those biased thoughts arise.
Exactly. And the more we practice this, the better we become at recognizing and challenging our biases before they translate into discriminatory actions.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I'd love to explore how technology, specifically BIM, can play a role in promoting inclusivity and accessibility in the AEC industry. Harry Lewis has some fascinating insights on this in his article.
He makes a brilliant point about how BIM's emphasis on digitization can inherently promote remote work and flexible arrangements, which can be a game changer for individuals with disabilities, caregivers, or those living in remote areas who might have faced barriers to participation in the traditional work environment.
Right. Opens up opportunities for people who might have struggled to find a place in a more rigid office-centric setting.
Absolutely. And Lewis also highlights how BIM allows companies to tap into a global talent pool, breaking down geographical barriers and giving access to a wider range of perspectives and experiences.
Because with BIM, location becomes less of a factor. You can collaborate with people from all over the world, regardless of where they're physically located.
That's right. And that's crucial for fostering innovation, right? Bringing together diverse minds to solve complex challenges.
Exactly.
He also argues that BIM can lower barriers to entry for people looking to join the construction industry. Think about it. Online learning platforms, virtual training programs, and digital certifications make it easier for people from all walks of life to gain the skills they need.
Especially for those who may not have had access to traditional educational paths. This opens doors and levels the playing field.
And BIM's use of automation and assistive technologies can be particularly beneficial for individuals with disabilities, enabling them to contribute even more effectively.
It's almost like BIM has the potential to create a more inclusive and equitable industry just by its very nature.
To a certain extent, yes. But Lewis cautions that effort is still needed to ensure equitable access to technology and policies that truly promote inclusion.
So BIM is a powerful tool, but it's how we use it that ultimately determines whether it fosters inclusion or exacerbates existing inequalities.
Well said. Now, shifting our focus to addressing discrimination more directly in the workplace, let's delve into the perspectives of Maulik Gangani and Kambiz Kordani. They offer some really valuable insights on this topic.
They both champion the idea of potential-driven leaders who prioritize creating inclusive workspaces.
I love that term. Can you elaborate on what they mean by that?
They argue that true leadership is about recognizing and nurturing the potential in every individual, regardless of their background or identity.
It's about creating an environment where everyone feels empowered to contribute their unique talents and perspectives.
And they stress that this requires a conscious effort to dismantle those systemic barriers that often prevent marginalized groups from reaching their full potential.
So it's not just about being nice or treating everyone equally. It's about actively working to create a more just and equitable workplace. Exactly. And Gangani and Kordani emphasize that this starts with acknowledging the reality of discrimination in all its forms.
Because it can manifest in so many ways, and it's not always overt or intentional. It can be subtle, embedded in the very fabric of our organizational cultures.
And it can be based on so many different factors: gender, race, age, religion, sexual orientation, disability. The list goes on.
And they both stress the importance of educating ourselves and our teams about these different facets of discrimination.
Right. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe to speak up if they experience or witness something that feels wrong, to challenge those subtle biases that often go unchecked.
And that means having clear anti-discrimination policies in place, but also ensuring those policies are actually enforced. It's one thing to have a policy on paper. It's another thing to truly live it out in our daily interactions.
Absolutely. Leading by example is key. If we as leaders consistently demonstrate fairness and respect in all our interactions, it sets the tone for the entire organization.
They also talk about the importance of diversity in hiring and team composition. A truly inclusive workplace should reflect the diversity of the world around us.
And they advocate for things like diversity and inclusion training to raise awareness and equip people with the skills to address these issues.
Having confidential reporting mechanisms for discrimination is crucial as well. People need to feel safe coming forward without fear of retaliation.
It's about sending that clear message: discrimination will not be tolerated in this workplace.
Now, for a bit of a thought-provoking twist, let's explore Ralph Montague's argument that not all discrimination is inherently bad. He presents a rather nuanced perspective on this.
It sounds counterintuitive at first, but his point is that we all make value judgments all the time, and those judgments often lead us to discriminate in the sense of choosing one thing over another.
Like choosing to spend time with our family over strangers, or prioritizing certain tasks over others.
Exactly. He calls this ethical discrimination because it's based on our values and responsibilities. It's about making choices that align with what's important to us.
It makes sense. We can't possibly treat everyone and everything equally all the time. We have to make choices based on our priorities and principles.
Right. And Montague argues that this ability to discern, to make those value judgments, is actually essential for effective leadership.
He even connects it to Simon Sinek's "start with why" concept, emphasizing that leaders who are clear about their values can more effectively guide their organizations.
Because they're able to make choices that support those values, even if it means discriminating against things that don't align.
So it's not about abandoning discrimination altogether. It's about being mindful of the basis for our choices.
Exactly. However, Montague is careful to differentiate this from social discrimination, which is based on prejudice and bias against certain groups of people. That's the harmful kind of discrimination we need to actively combat.
So it's a fine line to walk, but it's a critical distinction for leaders to understand.
Absolutely. Ethical discrimination, when rooted in our values and used to make responsible choices, can actually be a positive force.
But we have to be vigilant to ensure that it doesn't morph into that harmful social discrimination that perpetuates inequality and injustice.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into cultural competence, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What are those essential nuggets of wisdom they can take back to their teams and projects?
I think the overarching theme that emerges from all these different perspectives is the crucial importance of awareness.
Awareness of our own cultural biases, the cultural nuances of our teams, and the potential impact of our actions on others.
Precisely. And it's about embracing that dance between order and chaos that Montague talks about, respecting differences, while finding that common ground that allows us to work together effectively.
We've heard some incredible stories and insights from Rina, Sahay, Daria, Zimovets, Larry Bridgesmith, Harry Lewis Maulik, Gangani, Kambiz, Kordani, and Ralph Montague.
Each of them shedding light on different facets of this complex and ever-evolving topic.
And I think the ultimate takeaway is that Building a truly inclusive and equitable workplace is an ongoing journey, not a destination. It requires continuous learning, self-reflection, and a commitment to challenging our own biases.
It's about cultivating that growth mindset, that willingness to embrace discomfort and to see every interaction as an opportunity to learn and evolve.
Couldn't agree more. And if you're feeling inspired to delve deeper into this topic, be sure to check out the free leadership program on www.bimhero.io.
It's a fantastic resource packed with practical tools and strategies for developing your leadership skills in a globalized world.
And don't forget to subscribe to BIM Heroes Radio on YouTube and Spotify for more deep dives into the world of AEC leadership.
We'll be back next week with another episode exploring new ideas and insights to help you lead with confidence and create a more inclusive and innovative future for our industry.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.